Hey guys, welcome back to the UNCOMMODiFiED podcast and to another UNCORK conversation with my friend Craig Minchin and leadership historian. Craig, how you doing tonight, man?
Fantastic. Always great to be with you, my friend, as always.
Awesome. I love calling you leadership historian because when I first met you, you were just a small wee child, and now you're a leadership historian, Craig Minchin. What happened?
I got curious about the world, apparently. Yeah, you and I have known each other for a long time. I'm not sure if I was a small, wee child, but
No, but listen, the myth that we have, it's not
yeah,
always about the true story. It's about the myth and the
right.
narrative. Isn't that sort of
Awesome.
what history is all about, Craig?
Oh, it certainly is. It
A
full on,
little
absolutely.
bit of myth, a little bit of fact, lots of fact, a little bit
Yeah,
of magical myth here and there every once in a while.
yeah, yeah. As Gandalf the Grey says, every good story deserves a little embellishment. So
That's
yeah,
true.
absolutely.
And Gandalf was a real figure, of course.
Of course he was, as are hobbits, and yeah. Anyway, yes.
Well, listen, let's not get into hobbits because we don't want to be criticizing a certain height of people.
Yeah.
We don't want to do that. All right, listen, that's enough shenanigans to get things started. We've been doing this several episodes, and today's going to be an awesome conversation. And again, for our listeners, thanks for joining us. All things crazy will happen when Craig and I chat, and we're going to have a great conversation tonight. But of course, every great conversation between Craig Minchin and Tim Windsor starts with a whiskey, whether we are podcasting or not, sir. And tonight
Yep.
is no different. And so today, what do you have to drink, my friend?
Well, I came home to a treat a couple of months ago,
Mm-hmm.
and it was a my lovely wife signed me up for a whiskey club, and I got my first bottle. And so I'm
Yes.
drinking a. It came in a very fancy box, a very very fancy box. This is a 25-year Tomatin from the Scottish Highlands, and this is a treat for me. A nice single malt 25-year. I don't.
25 year. Yeah.
Yeah.
Showing me up, brother. I like the way you roll and your wife, showing me up. But I have selected again for our conversation the same thing I drank the last time we talked because you gave it to me. It's a beautiful Irish whiskey called Natterjack, which
Nice.
I have taken on as my new nickname, Natterjack.
Excellent. Awesome.
So cheers to you, sir.
Cheers, buddy. Awesome.
Awesome. Let's see what we got here. That's a good conversation. Great
Excellent.
whiskey to
Excellent.
uncork a conversation.
Yeah.
Tonight, we're going to have a conversation which will be a little bit different. And its genesis is a bit different. And so let me explain as you guys listen into this conversation today where the genesis comes from. So a couple of months ago, I had the privilege of sitting down and doing an uncorked conversation with my friend and art psychotherapist, Lenore Walker. If you haven't listened to that, pick it up. Go listen to it. You gotta tuck in and listen to that. It's a great episode. But when I asked Lenore a question near the end of that about some of her heroes in her own life journey, she mentioned Indira Gandhi, and I have to admit I didn't really know much about Indira Gandhi. I know who Gandhi is, but sad for me and bad on me. I had really no idea. I knew the name Indira Gandhi, but didn't really know much about her. And this is, by the way, if you don't have a friend like Craig in your life, by the way, you should get a friend like Craig because this is what happens. You sit down with Craig, you go for dinner at Craig's house, and you say, hey, what do you know about Indira Gandhi? And Craig says, not that much, but I could research her. And I'm like, excellent. See, this is the great gift of having Craig Minchin in your back pocket as your friend. So you go off and you start this crazy journey of researching Indira Gandhi, and now we're sitting down having a whiskey, and we're going to have a great conversation about somebody that you've begun to research and explore.
Yeah, yeah, and you're absolutely right. That's actually how the conversation went because I really didn't know a whole lot about her at all. That's the thrill of the chase for me, Tim. And I love exploring characters, stories, other narratives that I really don't know. And so, understanding her life, it's a privilege to really to research these characters.
Well, I appreciate that. And again, the discipline and the hundreds of hours of work that goes into this. And the great thing for me is I only got 20 minutes of prep. I get to host the conversation and then I can say it's mine. I mean, this is a great world that we live in, Craig, is it not?
It is. It's awesome. It's fantastic. Well done. Well done.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, listen, before we get started, let me do something before we get started. So, Craig, you have released recently in the last couple of months, you've released something that people need to know about it. You now have a website.
I do.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, I
And
do.
what is the name of that website?
Okay, it's at historyunfurled.com. And it was, it's an opportunity for just me to get in there and retell some stories. It's inspired by some of the conversations that you and I have had together, and some other stuff that's really piqued my curiosity last year. You'll jump in there. It's still in its beginning, early stages, but you're going to see like a whole bunch of blog posts about Alexander the Great. You're going to see some stuff about Haile Selassie. You're going to see some other stories in there. But yeah, that is a new venture that I'm going through. HistoryUnfurled.com.
Awesome, a great name. And so again, if you like the conversations that Craig and I have, and you want to explore Craig's mind a little bit more on the interweb, that's the place to go. So shameless plug for the new
Awesome. Thank you.
website, historyunfurled.com. Excellent name. I love it. Now, let's unfurl this conversation about Indira Gandhi. So, listen, catch me up a little bit. Give me a history lesson in, I don't know, 2 or 5 minutes or less or something like that. Give me a bit of a history lesson. Who is Indira Gandhi? Why should we be interested in her? What's her story? When did she live? What's going on? Tell us about this woman.
Okay. So I'll start off as most stories start off at the beginning. She was born in 1917. She was the daughter of a political legend, and I'm going to say the name once, and I probably won't be able to pronounce it again, Jawaharlal Nehru. So I'm just going to refer to him as Nehru by his last name because that works with my English-speaking tongue a little better. So she was the only child of him and Kamala Nehru. And he was a legend. He was like a freedom fighter. He was right at the cusp of Indian independence from the mighty British Empire. He was doing a lot of that groundwork before World War I, World War II, and before obviously the Constitution was made and they were given their own independence. He was the first Prime Minister of India, and he was a formidable character. You and I, it's funny, you and I have talked a lot about different personalities over the last year or so that you've been posting or hosting the UNCOMMODiFiED. And, one of these days I'm going to develop something on the great people behind great people. Because similar to Churchill, Alexander the Great, Indira Gandhi had very impressive figures behind her. Before he went into politics, he was a very successful lawyer. Him and his father had built a very successful law practice. They were educated in English. They were, part of, I guess, the aristocratic family. And that actually went back generations and generations and generations. So no matter who was in power in India, it seemed the Nehru family was always connected in some way, shape, or form. So she was, like I said, the only child of the first prime minister. She herself became the third prime minister in Indian history, the first female prime minister. Led an incredibly interesting life, complicated family life, complicated cultural life, complicated, political life. There was nothing really straightforward about her. And one thing, and this is embarrassing to admit this, but one thing I discovered about her, Indira Gandhi is not related to the Gandhi. That was new for me, and it's embarrassing to admit that, assuming there's only one person in India with the last name Gandhi. She was not related to
Just so you know, I have to admit, and I'll just be really honest, when the first time I heard the name Indira Gandhi, I was like, well, I must be Gandhi's wife. And I thought to myself, what a patriarchal son of a bitch kind of conversation I was having with myself. Well, if I know her, she must have been somebody's famous wife. And I was like, wow, dude.
Yeah.
Go get a cultural gut check.
It was crazy. Well, Tim, I had the same experience, So part of my research into these characters, these people that we've been talking about, is getting into the culture and getting into the history of the land and the environment that they grow up in. And it's funny, as you and I are joking around about, like, oh yeah, there's only one person named Gandhi. She must be related to them. Well, India has like what, a fifth of the world's population on that subcontinent. It is considered one of the founding locations of human civilization in the Indus Valley. Mm-hmm. So it's a massive country, an ancient country, ancient history, and there's a heck of a lot of people there. So she was not related to the Gandhi that we know. However, I will say she ran in those circles, and her father and grandfather were quite close with Mahatma Gandhi. She knew him quite well. She actually got the last name Gandhi when she married someone named Firuz Gandhi. So not the Gandhi, but someone else who was also impressive and complicated in his own ways.
Interesting. No, it's fascinating. And hey, I got a question. So, have you ever been to India?
I have never been to India. No.
Okay, so I had the privilege of going to India probably, oh gosh, I'm getting old, so I can't forget, but I want to say maybe 15 years ago. I had the
Right.
privilege of going to India to do some charity work and flew into Mumbai, and then we traveled down south to Kerala, up through Tamil Nadu and into Kerala, and just a unique experience, cultural experience, very different than I expected. Obviously,
Mm,
from the crush of the mass of people in Mumbai, it was a really cultural awakening. I mean, when we went from the airport, we went through, the just the slums of Mumbai and
right.
that area, and it was just a really horrific experience as you go through it. And then we stayed in this hotel on the ocean that was like gold leaf everything. It was this utter opulence, and you very quickly saw this two different stratospheres of population. And then we went down to the south, and the south is quite interesting because very different than I thought geographically. We were in a tea growing region in Kerala, very mountainous, lush. It was quite cold, which was surprising to me. But again, yeah, I had this idea that hot, sort of hot, all hot,
Yeah.
humid all the time. We were in a part that was quite cool at that time of year in southern India. So again, what a diverse cultural experience. Happened to
Yeah.
be there during Diwali, which was really awesome. What a great experience. But I've been so privileged to be able to go to different parts of the world and experience
Yeah.
some cultural things there. And it also makes me intrigued by the kind of people that have been part of shaping these countries. Again, not perfect people, as we've talked about, but people that shape the destiny of nations. What fascinating thing. So I know, in talking to you, and one of the things that you had written and I read, I mean, I think that people called her they called her the mother of India, I think. Did they
Yeah.
not?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like,
Absolutely.
what was how did that happen? Like, how did she end up being called that? What was the background there?
Yeah. So she, I was thinking it's got to be difficult to be the child of a legend and a living legend, to live up to those expectations. And she really forged her own path with her identity, not exclusive to her father's influence, because she really did admire her father tremendously. And I don't think there's a way you couldn't admire him. He was a very commanding presence. But her entry into politics came very slowly, and that was her avenue for power. It wasn't the legal area, it wasn't education, it was in politics. And why they started calling her Mother India, and this is again remarkable, just the scope of the country and the diversity of its population. She, to simplify it, she had the ability to really connect with people.
Hmm.
And it's interesting. Her father wrote her a letter. After they were going through some tough times, just a father-daughter kind of some tough moments. He wasn't quite getting her. There was some mental health conversations going on, and by his own admission, he said to her, and this is as she was an adult. He said, I think I've understood crowds very well in my career, but I don't have what you have. I don't really understand individuals and people. And
Interesting.
so, yeah, so she had the ability to connect with people, but also obviously in politics, you have to be able to connect with crowds as well and groups. And she was able to find political success by crossing over traditional barriers, cultural and political interest. Most of her success came as a result of forging alliances with smaller political groups that were outside the fringe of her own party. And so she was able to build political alliances. And, politics is all about power and finding out, okay, what do you need to be happy? Here's what I can offer. This is what I need. And she was able to really go through a lot of different groups, build a lot of alliances with people. And that's really how she got the name. Her showing up in her younger days prior to her formally getting involved with politics and helping out with refugee situations on the ground, like personally handing out bread and blankets and medicine and coordinating efforts there. That's also going to help create a very maternal image of her.
Interesting. So not the mother of India, but actually was called Mother India.
Mother
Interesting.
India, yeah.
No, that's really fascinating. And and it is interesting because, again, as we look at nations and we think of this collective and what you just said her father said to her is very
Mhm.
fascinating. I understand crowds, but you understand people, the individuals.
Yeah.
And what an interesting challenge for all of us, thinking about just what does that mean to me? Like as you talk, I think about what does this mean to me? As our listeners today or tonight, depending on when you're listening to this podcast, maybe that's a good question you can ask yourself. What does this mean to you?
Mm.
And what does it mean to, to see crowds, and what does it mean to see people, individuals? And, maybe we need to understand that a little bit, because we get lost in the crowd and we don't see individuality, and then we're not able to respond to the needs of people in the same way. So you can start to see how that's formative for sure in that. So, as she goes through life, I'm assuming she's got some confidants, she's got some counselors, she got some people that she gets advice from. And in any leader's life, there's good advice, there's great advice, and then there's rather terrible advice, I'm sure, that they get. There's wise advice, there's foolish advice, there's lots of stuff that comes at them. How does that sort of tuck in and play into her story?
Yeah. Well, I'd say for most of her life, her biggest confidant, and this got touching, was actually her father. So the relationship, it's very touching and heartwarming to hear that even in those upper echelons of political influence and global leadership, at the end of the day, who she went to most for advice was her father. And she actually, because her mother died when she was relatively young, I believe Indira was in her teens when her mother died. So her and her father became quite close, and she actually supported her father on his journeys to America as he went to go sell India to the world and to Europe and whatnot. So, but when he passed away, it was very natural that his confidants became her confidants and her close advisors. So she was very wise initially to make sure she surrounded herself with. It's kind of like any friend of my dad's is a friend of mine, and there were people that were at his level politically who saw her as just someone to manipulate, and there were people at his level who just saw her as someone to encourage, support, and direct and give wise counsel to. So she certainly had an abundance of people, and these people were like the real Gandhi. I mean, they were right there at the cusp of the freedom movements. They were there writing the Constitution. They were writing, like, they were all lawyers. They were all well educated. They were all very articulate, multilingual. So she surrounded herself with people who really reminded her of her father and really deposited a lot of wisdom into her for most of her life until she decided not to listen to them.
Very nice. Now, so hold on, just to clarify. So was she a lawyer, or was?
She herself wasn't. Most of the
Okay,
founders of the country were British
okay,
educated lawyers.
but she wasn't.
Yeah, the Indian-born British educated lawyers. She herself didn't go down that path. Um, but most of her father's associates definitely were in that legal realm, and
Okay,
continued to surround her and support her after his death.
okay. So listen, as we've talked about her a little bit in advance of this conversation, there were three words that sort of stuck out in some of the things that we dialogued about, and that is just understanding the vision from her perspective and what that looks like. And there's three words that we touched on. And those words were committed, they were courageous, and they were combative, which doesn't seem to fit with the other words. But
Yeah,
so
yeah.
explore those three words as in relationship to Indira Gandhi and her vision and how she was operating, because those are three words that you and I when we talked, I saw them sort of come up in our conversation a little bit.
Yeah, yeah. So she was. So it's a new country. When she took the prime ministership, it was still a young country. It was still trying to find its way in the world. It was taking place. It was coming into its, I guess, toddler years, right at the height of the Cold War. And if you look at a map, and I've looked at a map of India and the geopolitics of that region many times over the last year or so, you're close to Russia. You're close to China. You're close to Iran. You have still the British Empire, which is shrinking all over the place, and the new American, influence that's crawling out into the world. So her commitment was she essentially wanted to continue on her father's work. She wanted to elevate the, it's a dated term, but the lower classes, the poor. She wanted to elevate them and lift them up. And she understood in order to really impact the people, and this is why she built her relationships with those other political parties, she had to break out of the ruling party, which is, by the way, called the the syndicate, they called them. Now, if that isn't an ominous sounding name, the Congress syndicate, that was the open name for these guys, and they were the power brokers. And
Wow.
so her commitment was, they're the ones who are controlling, or they think they're controlling the country, but I'm so committed to this cause of uplifting the poor, of really this into the vision, building into the vision that my father had to make this a country where everyone can succeed, where the caste system, that brutal caste system that just oppresses people, is just broken and destroyed. And that's why she was committed to really going toe to toe with the power brokers of the company, of the country, and she was quite successful in that. So they actually put her name forward for prime minister, not because they believed she would be a great leader. They put her name forward because they thought she could be easily manipulated and
I-
influenced.
Interesting.
And boy were they wrong. Boy were
Uh,
they wrong.
they got to run for their money
That's awesome.
in
Awesome
this
part of the
lady.
story. Awesome part of the story. Yeah.
Now that's fascinating. So they push her forward for leadership because they figure they can control her, and then
Absolutely.
her sense of passion and commitment to other causes
Yeah.
begins to be a bigger driver than her fear of them or their control of them.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. 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 And she had like, endless energy. She almost had this supernatural like fitness regime that she went on, each day, getting up at like ridiculous hours, like 3 o'clock in the morning, and meditating and yoga and doing whatever exercises, and doing the work of the government. And then during political campaigns, she was on planes and off planes, on planes and off planes. Many people commented about her personal energy levels, and just mystified how she was able to do what she did. But yeah, she was not afraid to go toe to toe with the real power brokers. And I think that takes an element of, well, other than intelligence, but that takes a lot of commitment and courage to do that.
Right. So her this courageous sense of how she faced that. Is there other areas or other stories that you read that just sort of tip into this idea of her courage and her courageousness as a person as she navigates these times?
Yeah, and I think I referenced really briefly the fact that India was, coming into its toddler years during the height of the Cold War, and so she was getting pressure from, the U.S. to kind of ally with them, the USSR obviously to ally with them, and she was able to navigate that Cold War. I call it the chess match. Asia was really a chess match for the Cold War players, and she was, I wouldn't say play them off each other, but she was able to navigate very confidently those two competing powers. So when she went to the U.S., Lyndon Johnson was the president at the time, and he just fawned all over her. Thought she was an incredibly impressive leader, impressive woman. Because again, remember, there weren't too many female global leaders at the time. I think she was one of the first. And Margaret Thatcher was close on her heels as well. But I think just her courage, her ability to really navigate that Cold War, knowing that the players, could find very nefarious ways to make her political career come to a very rapid end. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't afraid to go to hotspots in her own country. There was one story where there had been a massacre, and at the end of the day, it's portrayed as a caste kind of massacre. The upper class caste murdering lower caste farmers. It seemed to be more like a gang war, but a lot of the victims were lower caste people, and the village, small village, people were devastated, and she just jumped in. I think she first started off in a pickup truck, and then that got stuck in the mud. And this is after she's been prime minister, by the way. This is not limo service. When it got stuck in the mud, she jumped into a farmer's tractor, and then when they reached a river, she jumped on an elephant and crossed the river. Also, so she could go to this hot spot, and it was a hot spot that was dominated by, bandits, warlords, and I think she was probably in her 50s or 60s at that point in time. That's pretty courageous to run into the heart of darkness, so to speak.
Yeah, she had a little bit of chutzpah going on for her.
She certainly did, yeah.
But I would think though also as a woman leader at that level in that time of culture where a culture in that time where women weren't leaders. I mean, in a sense,
Yeah.
you mentioned Mrs. Maggie. I mean, the reality is these women were blazing trails and they had to go toe to toe in a quote man's world and man, they held their own. It's interesting though. I hate to say this, but I mean, I got some of my history from The Crown, so it's probably not really good history, Craig. But man, when you watch The Crown and you see Margaret Thatcher in The Crown, and you see the depiction of her going toe to toe with her male counterparts, the interesting thing I found there is that behavior that we would venerate in a man as strength, right? We funny enough, when you see it in a woman in that case, somehow it's like, oh, that's not right. There's something not
Yeah,
right. There's something not very womanly about that, you know.
yeah,
But yet you see this interplay in The Crown with her, with who she is as a mother and all of the stuff going on. But then she is just able to stand toe to toe. And again, maybe that's one of the things that I find intriguing in this conversation, that sometimes, and we've come a long way in our culture, but in some ways we haven't come a long way. We still, I think, look at certain qualities in women and say, well, that's not womanly, or in a man and say, that's not manly. You know, we've got this blurred sense of femininity and masculinity and what it means to be a man or a woman in leadership. And we've got to really challenge and drop those stereotypes, because I think they still exist in some ways, Craig. Would you agree with that?
oh, absolutely, absolutely. And and Tim, we miss out though, and we also
Yeah.
miss out on what people have to bring to the world,
Yeah.
whether male or female, when we kind of, you know, belittle it in one gender while praise it in the other.
Yeah.
And just for the record, I sense there's a conversation about Margaret Thatcher coming up with you and I at some point in time.
I think so.
The portrayal in The Crown,
Yeah.
what you just described, is pretty accurate. And she had the ability, because I've also done some research in Margaret Thatcher recently. She, like Indira Gandhi, had the ability to really go toe to toe with a very male dominated field at the time. And at the end of their lives and their journeys, be really praised and commended for doing so, and the courage to do so, and the skills that they exhibited while they did that.
Awesome. So that leads to that third C that seems incongruent. You know, we got this committed, courageous, and then we got this combative. We're talking a little bit about that combative nature. So she was able to battle and go to battle for the things that were important to her and what made sense to her and what she wanted to defend. Is there any other ways that you saw that in your research as you sort of looked into her life?
Yeah, yeah, and it's funny because combative. My initial, when I wrote that down, I was like, that's a negative quality. That's an awful, like, no one wants to work with someone who's combative. At certain times in her political life, I would say it was necessary, but as she got more entrenched, and I think as her leadership got more stable, and I've seen this, in Alexander the Great, I've seen this in Churchill. Something happens with leaders when they get almost overconfident and they lose focus of what got them where they're at right now. And she was she was almost became autocratic, I guess you would say, or authoritarian is maybe a better word for it. It's funny. All these leaders that we talk about, and at the end of the day, I think the people we've talked about are great leaders. I think history reflects well on them. They're great people. But, your perspective on them, like you may have a different perspective on them. And, you mentioned Indira Gandhi's name to people, and they may start blushing and they go wonderful and fawning over them. Or, as I found out, they may go red in the face and say what a tyrant she was. So, and that's part of her character, and that's part of why we talk about them, because these folks do have flaws. These leaders do have flaws, but she had no problem. I think sometimes unnecessarily picking fights. She picked a very well-known fight with the whole region in the Punjab, which is dominated by a Sikh population, and that didn't end so well for her, and that actually ended up being probably her biggest probably the biggest mistake of her life. But yeah, she had no problem going to battle with people, being argumentative, kind of digging her heels in. Once she was in power, and once she learned how to kind of pull the levers of power. And there's a well-known period just called the emergency years. It's funny, we're living right now in a strange time in our country.
Yep.
Lockdowns and shutdowns and stay-at-home orders. The emergency years went on literally for years, and it was like martial law. And she was quite combative during that time with anyone. Basically shut down the government, shut down anyone's voices, shut down media, shut down basically anything and everything. So, at times it helped her to be combative and to really stick up for herself. But once she got really empowered, I think it became a bit of a millstone around her neck.
Well, as you talk about that, what I think about is it's like whether it's being combative or being or anger, call it whatever you want. It's what you directed at. That's really the issue. It's not, the emotion and that passion is so important. To be combative, to go to battle against the right things is a great thing. But if we're
Yeah.
not careful, we're using the same force and maybe we're applying it in the wrong way. And again, that's what I find fascinating about these conversations because, one, you see yourself in these people, but you also see their great things, you see their negative things, and we associate ourselves with certain things. But, I would consider myself a rather combative person at times. You know this. Our wives have chatted about my combativeness. Now at times I don't direct that in the right way, and at times that I think I do. So again, it's just how do we balance and how do we grab a hold of all of this stuff that's in us, and how do we direct it in the right way? And I guess as you're listening to the conversation, wherever you're listening, if you're listening on iTunes or Spotify or Pandora or Amazon Music or wherever you listen to your podcast, and whatever day it is or time of day or night it is, ask yourself these questions. What are you committed to? What are you courageous about? What are you combative over? And again, not are these negative or positive in nature, but are you directing them in the right way? I mean, I think that's the challenge that she faced, that we all face. And again, I do love this interplay because we talk about people and we don't just, talk about the myth and the legend of who they are. They're an amalgam of all these things. And it's interesting to me that you say that she was part of instituting sort of these taking away of rights when in the beginning she was all about trying to restore rights.
Yeah.
And it reminds me a little bit of the Lincoln miniseries that I recently watched. And by the way, if you haven't seen that series, you guys should watch it. It's phenomenal. But the thing that I found fascinating in there as well, same kind of journey. And I don't know if you know this, Craig, but, in the beginning of Lincoln's life, he was, newspapers and editing and all that was a big part of his journey. And he was a voracious reader and the press. And he loved that freedom that the press had. But there was a period of time as president that he started cracking down on the freedom of the press. And controlling the message that they were writing and putting them in jail over their messages. So you got this juxtaposition in these people's lives. They're not this pristine pureness, of glory. Sometimes it gets rather ugly. And it's not quite as pristine as we think it is. And as you said, some people look at Indira Gandhi and see a hero, and another look at her and maybe see a villain. And maybe the truth lies somewhere in the middle. She's an amalgam, like we all are, of light and darkness.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And we have that choice, to let the better angels of our nature kind of win the day, and they don't always win the day.
No.
They certainly don't.
No, for sure. So listen, as we, we'll start bringing this conversation to an end, and obviously we don't have enough time to explore this, and, maybe you'll, by the time this goes there, maybe you'll have some other writings on your website. What is that website again called, Craig Minchin?
It is historyunfurled.com.
historyunfurled.com. Who knows? If you go check it out, maybe you'll find some more details on the life of Indira Gandhi. And if you don't find it there yet, it'll be there, I'm sure. But you'll find lots of other things there if you're interested in history and how we can learn from it, how it impacts us, how it teaches us. That's a great website for you to check out, and you can continue to connect with Craig and explore his thinking with these ideas that he'll be sharing. But let me ask you. So she obviously had failure like everybody else. She didn't have just success. So did she have significant failure, and how did she find her way through it? Did she get destroyed by it? Did she figure her way through it? Did she recover well from some significant failings in her life? What was that part of her story?
So, I be honest with you, that's the part of everyone's story right now that I'm digging really, really deep into, because I find because we all deal with failures, we all have flaws. And these leaders are no different. And her behavior during the emergency years, and I believe it was 6 years that they lasted, and I told you a little bit, just curbing all the freedoms that she wanted to fight for initially. But there was one character in her life. I told you she surrounded herself with her father's wise counselors, and she listened to them until she decided not to. Well, there's one character she decided not to listen to, and this was not her father's advisors. This was her youngest son.
Hmm.
And, I try and, when I look at these stories, I try and give people the benefit of the doubt. We have the benefit, the lens of history, and try not to kind of judge their actions a little too much. Sanjay Gandhi was probably the closest thing to a villain in her life, a really nefarious character. And to this day, people don't understand how he had influence over his mother because she was such a formidable person herself. Um, he had no leadership experience. He had he didn't seem to be a deep thinker at all. No political experience, no life experience. But somehow he persuaded his mother to pull the political strings and give him a license to manufacture India's first homemade automobile. Multi millions of dollars. And that was at 22 years old. No experience in the auto industry, no experience in engineering, in business. And that was just the tip of the iceberg with him. One thing he did, one bit of poor counsel he gave her, and he gave her plenty of poor counsel, and for whatever reason she listened to it, was the Punjab region. I referred to it largely a Sikh dominated part of the country. And during the emergency years, there was concern that the Sikh population was going to rise to the point where they could vote to become an independent nation themselves. Good for India, good for us. And so Indira asked her son, please find me a Sikh representative from that region who can help split the Sikh vote. So it's common political practice, it's kind of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Find me someone who could help split the Sikh vote so we can, maintain our power over there. Because if they're fighting each other, they're not going to be able to get the separatist vote. And he did. And Jatinder Bindrawali, that'll be the last time I pronounce that name as well. They found Jatinder Bindrawali, and he certainly succeeded in splitting the Sikh vote. The problem was he was more radical than anyone in that country at the time. A young, charismatic leader who wanted to bring the Sikh population to a pure form of Sikhism. And, I've studied religious matters for most of my life. Whenever you hear someone talk about developing a pure form of religion, be scared, And so he basically was a fundamentalist terrorist and who was propped up by the Gandhi regime. It all ended with what's known as Operation Blue Star, where he had retreated to the temple, Amritsar temple, the Golden Temple, which is the holiest site for Sikhs. He barricaded himself with all his followers there. It's not just a temple, it's more like a complex. And the Indian military went in and killed him, but along with, I think, about 1,500 to about 5,000 followers, innocent civilians. And that hung around her neck. That was her decision to listen to her son, who was I guess, a terrible character. But to answer your other question, did she recover from that? Yeah, she did. And the cold reality is obviously those lives weren't recovered, and it had a long term impact on that region's relationship with the rest of India and with the government at the time, and even to this day. But yeah, she recovered from it for sure, and she recovered by once she got tossed out of office. So once the emergency years were over, she very naively thought, "Hey, no one's giving me bad feedback, so I think I'm going to call a general election for the first time in 6 years." Well, no one was giving her bad feedback because all her political opponents had been imprisoned, and she decided to release them. And the press was controlled, so she was defeated in a landslide. During her wilderness years, I call them, that's when she started to reconnect with the people. Some of her acts of heroism at that point in time. That's when she reconnected with one of her father's friends who had become an enemy over the years because she just cut him out of her life. And that's when she really defaulted to what made her so great in the first place. So brutal disaster, Operation Blue Star. It's legendary. Sikhs call it their 9/11.
Wow.
Yeah, they call it their 9/11. But afterwards, after a time of in the wilderness, yeah, she did recover, and was actually ultimately reelected to prime minister several years later.
Wow, it's an amazing story. It's interesting when you talk about this because we haven't chatted about this particular connective tissue, but you know, she was Mother India, but being a mother to her son became a real Achilles heel for her.
Yeah.
And then she went back into the wilderness years and maybe discovered that mothering part, that nurturing part. But, it's interesting that her greatest strength, like all of us,
Yeah.
tends to be her greatest weakness. So that's a really interesting thing that you just said that I never, that connection just is really hitting me now is that, again, often our greatest strength is our weakness. And what impassions us can imprison us if we're not careful. So, again, if you're listening to this conversation and you're just listening to this from a historical perspective and learning about Indira Gandhi for the first time, go out and read another book about her. Go do some research on the internet, find some other information about her life, and allow it to percolate and inspire you. But again, like everyone, she's this amalgam of light and darkness, as we all are, and this is where we kind of find ourselves. But I find it fascinating and I think it's true for me. That the greatest strength is often my greatest weakness. That's probably true for you, Craig, and for most of our listeners. And you can see the thread of that nurturing mother heart sort of in her is the thing that also allows her son to manipulate that piece, that part of her, in ways that other men were not able to manipulate her, apparently.
Yeah, absolutely. No, not even her father, like
No.
who I think was probably the closest thing to a hero figure for her. Not there's we have examples of where she was going toe to toe with her father, but for whatever reason, her youngest son had that power and control. And people have speculated; they've tried to get into the psychology of it all, and nothing conclusive. But no, that's a good point. What made her so great is also what led to her ultimate downfall.
Interesting. Well, I think Freud would have a few things to say about
Yeah,
that,
sure.
possibly. What do you think?
Yeah,
I
I'm
think
sure.
I think
I'm
you
sure there's some theories there.
I think you might. I think you might. So let me ask. So how does her story end? Where does her story go after this? She has a crippling defeat. She goes
Yeah.
through those wilderness years that you talk about. She finds her moves back to that original sense of calling, and then she's reelected. Where does her story go from there, and how does it end ultimately?
Okay. Well, we're going to go back to the Operation Blue Star and the repercussions of what happened there, and the agitation that was created between that community and her family and the government. And one of her advisors, I think it was like intelligence advisor, so someone in the inner circle, said this is bad news. There's going to be long-term repercussions. I advise you to remove anyone who's a Sikh who's on your personal protective detail. This is not a good situation. And I think what's commendable about her is, again, she was able to reach back to what made her so great, and that actually countered what she wanted to accomplish. She didn't want to divide people; she wanted to bring people together, and she actually felt that actually would actually broaden the divide between the Sikh community and her government. And so she refused to fire her Sikh security detail. And in 1984, it was actually two members of that same Sikh security detail that assassinated her on her property. And so she died in 1984. Upholding, I think, a very noble principle. Maybe it was naive. People can still debate that, but upholding a really noble principle. But she died at the hands of two very vengeful Sikh soldiers who had been with her for many, many, many years. But again, that moment was like their 9/11, and it was they obviously couldn't get over it, and that's unfortunately how her life ended.
Wow. And approximately how old was she around then? Do you any
I'm gonna
sense of how old she was?
I'm gonna say late 60s or so,
Okay.
and I'd have to fact check that. But yeah, I have this. She had lived a good full life, but I believe she had a lot more to give to that country.
Wow. So, as you read, and maybe, here, just for interest's sake, we haven't talked a lot about this, but first of all, thanks for doing some research and sharing this story, catching us up into her life today, and so we can be encouraged by it, we can be inspired by it, we can be warned by it. There's lots of lessons we can take from all of these great people's lives, but like when you decide on a whim, when I say, hey, let's go ahead, find out about Indira Gandhi. How do you start that process? Like, we never really talk about this, but let's leave the conversation about Indira Gandhi for a second. Let's talk a little bit about Craig Minchin's process. Like, how do you start digging into these characters? Like, what do you have the same process for everybody, Craig, or how do you do it?
So I think I found a process that works for me. So I'll start off, with documentaries. I also subscribe to a service where I get lectures on a whole bunch of different subjects. So I'll start off with kind of documentaries, the visual storytelling, just as a high level. And then usually I'll pick up a couple books. So I'll try and make my way through 2 books prior to you and I recording next. If someone has an autobiography out there, I'll try and read that. But I actually find the stories about that are written by people outside of that person to be far more interesting, because you and I have talked about, we don't like to make our flaws front and center
No.
in our stories of our lives. So I'll pick up a couple autobiographies. I'll get it, and then I start really digging into some of the context. So I have a sheet on, I have a whole bunch of information on India as a country, going back to its ancient roots, to its migration from, a bunch of kind of fiefdoms to British rule to its independence. So, it's a combination of, I make use of all the media sources out there. And for that time between you and I are recording, I just spend my time just immersing myself, in the topic from whatever sources I can.
Oh, yeah, it's fascinating, and I do really appreciate that. And thanks for sharing a little bit about sort of how that process looks for you. I mean, it's really fascinating for me, because what I find as we talk about history and different things, I become inspired by the past. It makes me think about my present moment and how I'm living, and then it sort of takes me into that future. It's like we go to this big journey of time, right? And the past really exists in our mind in some ways. It exists in books and biographies and in our mind. It doesn't exist in a way that we can touch it in the same way. But what a great gift to be able to reach into the past, sift through the sands of time, and find some grains of wisdom, ideas, provocation, as we look at the historic lives of people who've come and gone, who've been here before us. And who have had such a tremendous effect on the world that they encountered at the time. Again, it's so easy for us to judge in hindsight the good and the bad that they did, or the good and the bad that we perceive they did from our vantage point, but we really lack so much because we don't have the experience. But what a powerful opportunity to really examine history and let it examine us as we look into the future. And that's what I love about these conversations. Obviously, Craig, these are unique. They stand unique among the conversations that I have. I have so many different conversations with a bunch of different people. But it's nice that you and I have this recurring connection that we can have around different people, but really, again, exploring the history of their lives, what it means to us in the present moment, and what it ought to encourage us into the future. And so, again, if you're listening today, that would be my encouragement to you. Whether it's Indira Gandhi's life, or Alexander the Great, or whether it's Winston Churchill or MLK, when you think of the different leaders that Craig and I have talked about, what is it you're going to take from their lives? What are you going to sift from their lives? And what are you going to use to challenge yourself to live in a way that's substantive? My challenge whenever we talk, Craig, is I'm not a world figure like we're talking about, but I want to be careful that I don't take that and say, because they're this amazing world figures, that it doesn't apply to me in my little everyday world. And I think that's the power of this, that all of us are making history at some level in our lives. It may not be on the grander scale of countries and global impact, but we're all creating history, whether we're creating history in our own families, or we're creating history, in our communities, or in our greater family, or if we have the privilege of having children, we're creating history in the lives of our children, or whatever we're doing. It's easy to diminish our impact because we don't see ourselves on a world stage. And so as we finish up, Craig, what was one thing or two things from her life that just uniquely challenged you, that stuck their finger in your eye or your face or your heart, and sort of provoked you a little bit, that you found in her story that that will make an impact on you going forward?
And I think it's how we kind of ended off the story with her, and because this is part of my narrative a little bit, like yourself, not a world leader. I have my influence, but I'm like you. I'm making history in my own way. That despite her flaws and her failures, that wasn't the end of the story for her, and she got chances to redeem is probably too strong a word, but she got chances to continue to write the following chapters. And I think that's really, really important for us as we look at Indira Gandhi and all the other leaders we've talked about. When we talk about their flaws and their failures, but that's not the final chapter for them. There's more to be written. And so if we've kind of, if I've messed up, if I've failed, if I've made poor choices, if I had dramatic impact, I'm very thankful that my choices don't lead to the deaths of 1,500 people, or like Churchill, 123,000 people. But those flaws are not, as Churchill said, they're not fatal and they're not final. We have chances to make things right.
Great point. And listen, as you think about that, I just think about something I recorded a number of months ago. One of the episodes of the UNCOMMODiFiED podcast that I recorded is called the mystery and the magic of the unyet and the unmet moments of our lives. The mystery and the magic of the unyet and the unmet. If you haven't listened to that episode, maybe go back and listen to it, because in that I explore this idea that, again, our what's already done is written. We can't change it. We don't have a lot of control over it, but we do have unyet moments and unmet opportunities and people, even unmet problems. But we have things that we're going to yet encounter, and that's where our control comes. We can't change our past. We can't change either the great things or the devastation that we've created or we've experienced in our past. But we do have an opportunity to encounter the unyet and unmet moments that are still to come and write a story that is redemptive in nature. Maybe not, doesn't erase the past. It doesn't erase it, but maybe it redeems it, maybe it changes it, or it makes it different in some way. And I think that's the challenge that I take in this story today. Thanks for the research that you've done, Craig. And I want to thank Lenore Walker. Again, if you haven't listened to that episode that I did with Lenore, listen to that one. It's a great one. But that was the inspiration for this. So Lenore, thanks for inspiring me to think about a woman I didn't really think a lot about, who's been an inspiration to you. And now Craig has been inspired by her story, and now countless thousands, maybe as a result of listening to this podcast, will be encountered again by a woman maybe they don't know very well, and they'll go back and they'll touch her story and allow it to touch them. And as you do that, do me a favor, email me at tim@theuncommodified.com, or check me out on social media. Go to Craig's website. What's that website again, Craig?
It is the historyunfurled.com.
Absolutely. And let Craig and I know how you're uncorking this story of Indira Gandhi's life into your life and then out into the pages of your own story. Thanks for joining us, and have an excellent day.